The difference between life and death can come down to a single moment, a split-second decision that changes everything. For Mike Thompson, that moment arrived on a misty mountain highway in the pre-dawn hours, when a small dark shape in his headlights forced him to make a choice that would haunt him forever if he got it wrong. The veteran trucker had seen plenty during his 20 years navigating the treacherous curves of Route 67, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a terrified bear cub, alone and confused in the middle of his lane with the headlights of approaching traffic growing brighter in his rearview mirror. What happened next would test not just his skill behind the wheel, but the very limits of his courage and compassion. Through the thick morning fog, Mike eased his 18-wheeler along the familiar mountain pass, his truck's massive engine humming steadily as he made his way through the remote stretch of national forest land. The clock on his dashboard read 4:47 a.m., and his cargo of fresh produce needed to reach the distribution center by dawn. 20 years of experience had taught him every bend, every gradient, and every potential hazard along this isolated expanse. The gentle rhythm of the road beneath his wheels provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts as he reflected on his morning routine. He had left the truck stop 2 hours earlier, after his customary black coffee and brief chat with Ellen, the night shift waitress who had been serving him breakfast for nearly as long as he had been driving this route. The familiar sense of solitude reminded him why he had chosen this life, why these early morning drives brought him such peace. As his truck climbed higher into the mountain pass, the mist began to thin slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the dense pine forest that bordered the highway. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with moisture from the fog. Mike adjusted his speed slightly, knowing that these conditions often brought unexpected challenges. His years of experience had taught him that patience and vigilance were his best companions on mornings like this. Through his years on the road, Mike had encountered every kind of wildlife imaginable. Deer would frequently freeze in his headlights, their eyes reflecting like golden orbs in the darkness. He had seen majestic elk herding their young across the valleys, swift foxes darting between the trees, and even the occasional mountain lion slinking along the roadside. Each encounter had taught him something valuable about sharing the road with nature's residents. The road ahead appeared empty, a silent ribbon of asphalt stretching into the gathering dawn. The first hints of sunrise were just beginning to illuminate the eastern sky, though the thick cloud cover muted its usual brilliance. In these peaceful moments, Mike felt truly at home, master of his domain in the cab of his truck, surrounded by the raw beauty of the mountain wilderness. Little did he know that this routine morning drive was about to become anything but ordinary. The familiar stretch of highway ahead held an encounter that would challenge everything his 20 years of experience had taught him, testing not only his skills as a driver, but also his humanity in ways he could never have anticipated. As his truck rounded the next bend, the day's first real light began to break through the mist, and with it would come a moment that would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be a guardian of these mountain roads. Through the lingering mist, Mike's trained eyes caught a flicker of movement ahead. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the early morning light playing across the damp asphalt. But as his powerful headlights swept closer, the shadow took form, becoming something solid and unmistakably alive. A small, dark figure stumbled across the center line of the highway. Mike's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. There, illuminated in the harsh glare of his high beams, stood a bear cub no larger than a medium-sized dog. Its thick black fur was matted from the morning dew, and its movements betrayed a frightening mixture of confusion and panic. The cub wandered erratically across the lanes, its small head swinging from side to side as if searching for something or someone. Mike's experienced eyes scanned the roadside shoulders, knowing that where there was a cub, a protective mother usually followed close behind. But the dense tree line revealed no sign of an adult bear. The realization sent a chill down his spine. This tiny creature was completely alone on one of the most dangerous stretches of mountain highway. In his rear view mirrors, Mike spotted the distant headlights of approaching vehicles. The situation was rapidly becoming more precarious. The morning commuter traffic would soon begin in earnest, and this section of Route 67 was notorious for its blind curves and steep grades. Most drivers took these bends at full speed, trusting in empty lanes and clear visibility. But today, they would find neither. The Cub's behavior grew more erratic with each passing second. It would start in one direction, then suddenly freeze, spinning around to face the opposite way. Its small claws scrabbled against the smooth pavement, searching for grip on a surface that nature never intended it to traverse. Even from the height of his cab, Mike could see the Cub's sides heaving with panicked breaths, its survival instincts overwhelmed by the alien environment it found itself in. Mike's mind raced through the immediate dangers. The most pressing was the approach of other vehicles. Any driver rounding the bend at normal highway speed would have precious little time to react. The Cub's dark fur blended perfectly with the wet asphalt, making it nearly invisible until the last possible moment. And if the mother bear was nearby, any attempt to help could trigger a protective response that would put everyone in even greater danger. The fog complicated matters further, reducing visibility to mere seconds of warning. For oncoming traffic, the shoulder of the road offered no safe haven, dropping off sharply on one side and rising in a steep, rocky embankment on the other. This left the frightened Cub trapped in a deadly corridor of human construction, far from the safety of its forest home. Time seemed to slow as Mike watched the small bear's desperate movements. His 2 decades of trucking experience had taught him to recognize the signs of an imminent disaster, and every one of those signs was now flashing before him, like warning lights on his dashboard. The approaching vehicles, the confused Cub, the poor visibility, and the unforgiving mountain road were combining to create a perfect storm of danger. In the precious seconds that followed, Mike's mind raced through every safety protocol and regulation, drilled into him over 20 years of professional driving. Company policy strictly prohibited stopping on mountain highways except in absolute emergencies. The steep grades and limited visibility made any unscheduled stop potentially fatal, not just for the driver but for everyone else on the road. The weight of his cargo and responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. 40,000 pounds of fresh produce destined for morning deliveries. Countless families depending on their breakfast supplies arriving on time. His logbook allowed for no unscheduled stops, and he could already imagine his dispatcher's reaction to any deviation from the planned route. Yet as he watched the bear Cub stumble across the center line once again, another memory surfaced. 3 years ago, he had encountered a family of deer in almost the same spot. Following protocol, he had maintained his speed and course. The sickening thud that followed had haunted his dreams for months. He had done everything by the book that day, but the cost of following those rules had left a permanent scar on his conscience. Through his windshield, Mike could see the first rays of sunrise beginning to pierce the fog, creating a golden halo around the frightened Cub. The approaching headlights in his mirrors had grown larger, their beams cutting through the mist like searchlights. He estimated he had maybe 2 minutes before the first vehicle would round the bend, 2 minutes to make a decision that could save a life or end several. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he mentally mapped the highway ahead. The next mile featured a gentle upward grade, followed by a steep descent. If he stopped here, his truck would be visible from both directions, giving approaching drivers crucial extra seconds to react. The shoulder was wider at this particular stretch, a small mercy in an otherwise treacherous situation. Mike thought about his own daughter, how she had cried for weeks after finding an injured bird in their backyard. "But Daddy," she had said, "if we don't help, who will?" The simple wisdom of a child cut through years of professional caution and corporate regulations. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. With practiced precision, Mike began implementing emergency protocols. His right hand moved to the control panel, activating his 4-way hazard lights. The bright orange flashers would serve as the first warning to approaching traffic. He gently eased his foot off the accelerator, beginning a gradual deceleration that wouldn't send his trailer sliding on the wet pavement. His left hand reached for the CB radio. "Breaker, breaker. This is Mountain Mike on Route 67, mile marker 147. Got a bear cub on the highway and I'm initiating emergency stop. Any northbound traffic be advised." The radio crackled with acknowledgments from other truckers, creating an invisible network of support and warning. As his speed dropped, Mike scanned his mirrors constantly, watching for signs that any following traffic had noticed his warning lights. The massive truck began to shake slightly as it slowed against the grade, each vibration reminding him of the enormous forces he was attempting to control. He expertly guided his vehicle toward the rightmost edge of his lane, maximizing the space other drivers would have to maneuver around him. The decision to stop was only the beginning. Now he had to execute a plan that would protect not only the bear cub, but also every driver approaching this scene. His mind raced through the steps ahead, securing the truck, warning other motorists, contacting authorities, and somehow keeping the terrified cub from running into the path of oncoming traffic. The truck's air brakes hissed as Mike brought the massive vehicle to a final stop, positioning it at a slight angle that would make his warning lights visible from further around the bend. The morning mist swirled in his mirrors, and somewhere in the midst of it all, a small black form continued to move erratically across the deadly stretch of highway. With the massive truck now securely parked, Mike reached under his seat for his emergency kit. His hands found the bright orange reflective vest, slipping it on over his flannel shirt. The safety flashlight with its powerful beam and red strobe setting came next. Each deliberate movement felt like it took an eternity, but he knew rushing now could prove fatal. Before opening his door, Mike scanned the tree line one final time for any sign of the mother bear. The dense forest remained still, offering no clues about where the protective parent might be. His breath created small clouds in the cool mountain air as he carefully lowered himself from the cab, his boots meeting the wet asphalt with a soft splash. The bear cub looked even smaller from ground level. Its dark fur was soaked through, making it appear more vulnerable than Mike had initially realized. Up close, he could see it was trembling. Whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. The cub's eyes darted wildly around, reflecting the growing morning light with a haunting intelligence that made Mike's heart ache. Every step toward the frightened animal had to be measured and careful. Mike kept his movements slow and deliberate, remembering everything he had ever learned about wildlife encounters. The cub watched him with a mixture of curiosity and fear, occasionally making small whimpering sounds that seemed to pierce the morning silence. The distant rumble of approaching vehicles added urgency to the situation. Mike could hear engines straining against the mountain grade, growing louder with each passing second. He raised his flashlight, ready to signal to any approaching drivers, but his eyes never left the cub. One wrong move could send it running into the path of oncoming traffic. Sweat began to form on Mike's forehead despite the cool morning air. The physical and emotional strain of the situation was taking its toll. Each time the cub moved suddenly, his muscles tensed, ready to react. The responsibility of keeping both the animal and approaching motorists safe weighed heavily on his shoulders. The first vehicle appeared around the bend, a pickup truck that slowed immediately upon seeing Mike's hazard lights. The driver gave a questioning honk, but maintained a safe distance. More vehicles began to accumulate behind it, creating a growing line of confused and potentially impatient motorists. The sound of idling engines and occasional horns seemed to further agitate the already distressed cub. Mike's voice came out low and steady as he tried to calm the frightened animal. "Easy there, little one. Easy now." The words were more for his own comfort than the cub's, but they helped him maintain his focus. He had managed to position himself between the cub and the most dangerous part of the highway, but this also meant he was now vulnerable to both traffic and the possibility of the mother bear's sudden appearance. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing more of the surrounding forest. Mike continued to divide his attention between the cub, the growing line of traffic, and the tree line. Each passing minute increased the chance of the mother bear appearing, yet her continued absence was equally concerning. Bears don't abandon their cubs without reason. His back muscles cramped from maintaining his cautious posture, but Mike didn't dare straighten up. The cub had begun to show signs of exhaustion, its movements becoming less erratic but no less desperate. Several times it approached within a few feet of Mike before darting away again, torn between its instinctive fear of humans and its obvious need for help. A particularly loud truck horn shattered the tense atmosphere, causing the cub to bolt toward the center line. Mike's heart leaped into his throat as he moved to cut off its path, knowing he was risking his own safety but seeing no alternative. His sudden movement startled the cub back toward the shoulder, where it pressed itself against the rocky embankment, trembling violently. The physical drain of maintaining constant vigilance began to take its toll. Mike's legs burned from the tension of being ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. His neck ached from constantly scanning between the cub, the traffic, and the forest. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last as the gravity of the situation continued to weigh on him. The line of waiting vehicles had grown to nearly a dozen, and the sound of impatient horns began to echo through the mountain pass. A few drivers had emerged from their cars, their voices carrying across the pavement with a mix of concern and frustration. Mike could hear fragments of their conversations, some understanding the situation, others growing increasingly agitated by the delay. The morning fog, which had shown signs of lifting earlier, began to thicken again. A light drizzle started to fall, creating a fine mist that further reduced visibility. The wet conditions made the highway surface even more treacherous, especially for the growing line of vehicles forced to idle on the mountain grade. The weather seemed determined to complicate an already dangerous situation. With one hand still holding the flashlight to warn approaching traffic, Mike used his free hand to pull out his cell phone. The screen showed only one bar of service, typical for these remote mountain stretches. He tried dialing the state wildlife service, but the call wouldn't connect. The local sheriff's office number met the same fate. Each failed attempt increased his anxiety about the growing traffic situation behind him. The bear cub's behavior had become more erratic with the increasing noise and activity. It would press itself against the rocky embankment, then suddenly dart forward only to retreat again. Its fur was now completely soaked from the drizzle, making it look even smaller and more vulnerable. The poor creature's frightened whimpers cut through the noise of idling engines and distant thunder. A state trooper's car appeared at the back of the line, its lights flashing through the fog. The sight brought momentary relief to Mike, but he knew the officer's presence wouldn't necessarily solve the immediate crisis. The cub was still too frightened and unpredictable to approach safely, and the traffic situation was becoming more complex by the minute. Time pressure mounted as Mike checked his watch. The morning commuter rush would begin in earnest soon, bringing more vehicles and greater risks. Already he could hear the distant rumble of heavy trucks ascending the grade from the valley below. The blocked highway would soon create a dangerous backup that could stretch for miles in both directions. Some of the waiting drivers had begun attempting to turn their vehicles around on the narrow mountain road, creating new hazards. Mike watched helplessly as a minivan nearly slipped off the shoulder during an awkward three-point turn. The growing chaos only added to the cub's distress, causing it to pace frantically along the embankment. Mike's attempts to contact wildlife authorities continued to fail as the cell service faded in and out. Each passing minute felt like an hour, as he divided his attention between the frightened cub, the deteriorating weather, and the increasingly complex traffic situation. The responsibility of managing all these elements while keeping everyone safe seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The distant sound of an approaching helicopter broke through the morning mist, its rhythmic thumping growing louder as it neared the scene. Through the lifting fog, Mike spotted the distinctive green and white colors of the State Wildlife Service aircraft. The cavalry had finally arrived, alerted by one of the stopped motorists who had managed to find cell service further down the mountain. The helicopter circled once, assessing the situation from above before hovering at a safe distance to avoid frightening the cub further. A wildlife rescue van soon appeared, carefully maneuvering through the line of waiting vehicles. Two experienced handlers emerged, dressed in protective gear and carrying specialized equipment. Their movements were swift but calculated, speaking to years of experience in similar situations. A third team member began setting up mobile barriers, while consulting with the helicopter crew through their radio system. The lead handler, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and well-worn boots that spoke of countless rescues, approached Mike. Her eyes showed both concern and determination as she explained in hushed tones that they had found the mother bear, half a mile down the mountain. She had been struck by a vehicle, likely during the night, explaining why the cub had been wandering alone on the highway. The news hit Mike hard, understanding now why the little one had seemed so lost and desperate. Seoul. Team swiftly unfolded their rescue strategy with practiced precision. They positioned their vehicles strategically, creating a funnel-like formation that would help guide the cub away from danger. Special thermal blankets were readied, their silver surfaces gleaming in the strengthening morning light. The handlers, moved with careful synchronization, their years of experience evident in every calculated step. Working with practiced precision, the rescue team began their careful approach. They used special barriers to gradually restrict the cub's movement options, gently guiding it away from the highway and toward a safe capture point. The frightened animal's eyes darted between its would-be rescuers, but exhaustion had begun to override its fear. Each step of their approach was carefully choreographed, with team members communicating through subtle hand signals. The capture itself happened swiftly and professionally. Using a specialized net and transport carrier, the team managed to secure the cub without injury. The little bear offered only token resistance, its strength nearly spent after its terrifying ordeal. Mike watched as the handlers quickly examined the cub, their experienced hands moving gently but efficiently over its small body, checking for injuries or signs of serious distress. Their initial assessment brought waves of relief. Despite being cold, wet, and frightened, the cub appeared to be in relatively good health. No broken bones or serious injuries were immediately apparent. The team administered fluids through a gentle feeding tube, carefully warming the small creature with specially designed heating pads. Its shivering gradually subsided under their expert care, brown eyes growing calmer as the warmth seeped into its tired body. As the rescue team prepared the cub for transport, the lead handler shared more detailed findings with Mike. The little one was estimated to be about 4 months old, still completely dependent on its mother for survival. They would take it to their wildlife rehabilitation center, where it would receive round-the-clock care until it was strong enough to be released. Back into the wild, the facility specialized in orphaned bear cubs with dedicated staff and a proven track record of successful rehabilitations. The rising sun had finally broken through the mountain mist as Mike watched the wildlife rescue van disappear around the bend. The state troopers efficiently managed the traffic flow, and slowly the long line of delayed vehicles began to move again. Yet something had fundamentally changed in the veteran trucker's heart during those tense morning hours. Over the following weeks, Mike found himself thinking often about the little bear. The rescue team kept their promise, sending him regular updates about the cub's progress at the rehabilitation center. They had named him Lucky, though Mike privately thought of him as Little Mike. The photos showed the cub growing stronger each day, playing with other rescued bears and learning the skills he would need for survival. The incident sparked significant changes in highway safety protocols through the mountain corridor. New wildlife crossing signs were installed, and the Department of Transportation began planning for dedicated animal passages over and under the highway. Mike's trucking company, rather than reprimanding him for the unscheduled stop, used his story in their safety training programs as an example of professional judgment and compassion in crisis situations. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Mike found himself reluctantly cast as a hero. He was invited to speak at community events about wildlife safety and the importance of being vigilant on mountain roads. His daughter beamed with pride when her school asked him to talk to the students about his experience. The story seemed to touch something deep in people's hearts, a reminder that even in our fast-paced world, there was still room for compassion. 3 months after the rescue, Mike received a special invitation from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Lucky had grown strong enough for release back into the wild, and they wanted him to be present for the moment. Standing at a safe distance, Mike watched as the door to the transport cage opened and the once tiny cub, now considerably larger and healthier, took its first steps back into the forest. The experience changed Mike's perspective on his role as a trucker. He realized that being a professional driver meant more than just delivering cargo on time. It meant being a guardian of the roads they traveled, responsible not only for human safety but for the welfare of the wild creatures whose paths they crossed. Years later, Mike still drives the same route through the mountains. Sometimes, when the morning mist rolls in and the first light breaks over the peaks, he thinks about that frightened little cub and the choice he made. Every now and then, he spots a black bear in the distance, watching from the safety of the trees, and he likes to imagine it might be Lucky, thriving in the wilderness where he belongs. The story of the trucker and the bear cub became more than just a tale of rescue. It became a reminder that in our most challenging moments, when protocols and schedules demand one course of action, choosing compassion can make all the difference. For Mike Thompson, that misty morning proved that sometimes the biggest acts of courage come not from following the rules, but from following your heart. As this heartwarming tale of compassion and courage on the mountain highway comes to a close, we invite you to become part of our growing family of storytellers at Legacy Stories. Just like Mike's decision to stop that misty morning created ripples of positive change, your choice to join our journey can make a difference too. Subscribe to Legacy Stories on YouTube, where every week we bring you authentic tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, from brave truck drivers to dedicated wildlife rescuers, and countless other everyday heroes who remind us that compassion still thrives in our fast-paced world. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss a story that might just change your perspective, warm your heart, or inspire you to make your own difference in the world. Join our community today, because every story matters and yours could be the next legacy we share.